Hey everyone, this video is going to be a guide to solo PvPing and ganking in the Black Zone. Now, a lot of people say that solo PvPing in the Black Zone is just a terrible activity and that you don't want to do it. However, I would strongly disagree with them. It is definitely worse than it used to be 2 or 3 years ago, and is very difficult to get into with a harsh learning curve, but once you do, it can actually be a very fun and very profitable activity. So hopefully by the end of this video you'll be one step closer to engaging with some of the best content that Albion has to offer. Now really quickly, the first thing that I wanted to cover was the difference between solo red zone ganking and solo black zone ganking. So a while back I did a similar video to this one on solo red zone ganking, which link is in the description if you want to check it out, and it's pretty similar to black zone ganking except they have two major differences. The first is that Black Zone solo ganking is definitely harder, especially in the game knowledge department. It requires a lot more game knowledge for you to be effective, but it also has greater rewards that go along with that. I'm not sure about exactly money per hour if you would compare Black Zone and Red Zone ganking, but the people that you find and kill in the Black Zone are just so much higher quality in tier than the people in the Red Zone. The average kill in the Black Zone is worth about as much as a high tier kill in the Red Zone. Basically, solo Black Zone PvP is not noob friendly, but once you get good at it, it's incredibly rewarding. The second major difference is that Black Zone is a lot slower. It requires a lot more patience as there's just less people in the Black Zone. The Black Zone is just bigger than the Red Zone, and outside of deep in Archlands like Red Tree Enclave, at any given map it's just not going to have nearly the amount of people that any given Red Zone map will have. So if you're a patient person that likes a challenge for really big rewards, the Black Zone is for you. Otherwise, if you're a little bit newer or like more fast-paced action, I would suggest the Red Zone. Okay, so the first and foremost, most important thing to being successful at solo Black Zone PvP is choosing the right zones. In most zones in the Black Zone, there's almost nobody there. For the vast majority of zones, there might be one person in the entire map, and you're just not going to find them as a solo player. However, on the other end of the spectrum, there are also Black Zone zones that have 17 different hideouts and 150 players running around at any given time, making it practically impossible to gank anyone. So really, the key to finding a good zone is finding something in between those two extremes. In my experience, I've found two types of zones that are very good. The first is the high tier zones right around the rest towns in the Black Zone. So for example, around Arthur's Rest there's a tier 7 zone, a tier 8 zone, and another tier 8 zone within one map of it. These are all going to have a good amount of people that play out of those zones coming from the rest towns. The second type of zone that I've actually had more success in and is my favorite zones to gank are ZVZ Alliance home zones. So pretty much any big ZVZ based alliance is going to have some Black Zone presence and will most likely have a home zone in some high tier 7 or tier 8 zone. Now most ZVZ alliances are for more experienced players, so they don't have 1,000 hideouts in their zone, there might be 3 or 4, giving you plenty of room to gank people and also having a supply of people, of players from that alliance that are doing things outside of the ZVZ timers. For example, the best zones in the game are the tier 8 ones along the inner ring. There are always gatherers because of the high enchantment rate and just naturally other people around the zone because it's a tier 8 zone. Another option for an alliance ZVZ home zone that are really good are renter zones. Often ZVZ alliances will rent out hideouts in tier 8 and tier 7 zones to some newer guilds with newer players, and they often completely just play out of that hideout in that zone, so there's lots of prey of sort of inexperienced players for you to kill. Okay, the second thing that you need to know in order to be successful at solo Black Zone PvP is the type of people that you're going to run into. So I've separated the list of people into two groups, threats and targets, and thankfully it's a hell of a lot shorter than the Red Zone list was. Really, as a solo Black Zone player, you really only have one threat, and that's gank groups. This is where I love the quote, "There's always a bigger fish." You're going to be ganking in some of the most high value gank zones in the game with the tier 8 zones near the rest towns and ZVZ Alliance's home zones, Inner Circle. They all have high value targets, which means there's gonna be gankers, and since you're solo, you're a prime target for those larger gank groups. Really, this is the main problem and issue you're gonna run into solo PvP in the Black Zone, is gank groups. There's really not much you can do when you run into one of these gank groups. You usually just die and it kind of sucks. And unfortunately there's not much you can do about it to avoid them because you're just naturally going to be going in the same zones as they're going to be going. Now technically there are other threats to you as well, like ZVZers and group dungeoners and pretty much anything in a group, to be honest, but as long as you're not running into blobs or diving group dungeons, you're very rarely going to have to deal with any of them. Moving on to your targets, it's pretty much anyone who's solo in the Black Zone. Mainly these are two people, Gatherers and Solo Dungeoners. First and foremost, Gatherers are pretty much your main target. There's a lot of Gatherers in those high tier zones in the Black Zone. They're the only places where you can gather tier 8 outside of the Roads of Avalon, so there's a lot of Gatherers just constantly running around their home zones, gathering all of the tier 7 and tier 8 nodes in that zone. The really nice thing is that Gatherers in the Black Zone, especially the ones in tier 8 zones, are worth quite a lot of money every time you kill them, especially because they're pretty much all running special mounts. In fact, I would say at least 60% if not more of them run Pest Lizards, and the other ones are running things like Frost Rams and Boars and other high value mounts. Really, Gatherers are your go-to #1 target. Your second big target is Solo Dungeoners. Again, if you're in a high tier zone, there's always going to be people doing solo dungeons, and so catching them in between their dungeons can be really good. These people can be a little bit problematic as they do have a fighting build setup in solo dungeon clearing sets, and you have to dismount them first. So some of them will try to turn and fight you, but generally speaking, you can win the fights, and this is really where it can get a little bit difficult and you do want some PvP experience to be successful. That being said, hardly anyone goes solo in the Black Zone, so most of them run and assume that you have other gankers on the way to try to kill them. The next thing that you need in order to be successful is a good build. So when thinking about what build to go with, the most important thing is that you have a build that can kill players within 2 to 3 screens. Any build that takes too long to kill people will just make them very safe, as pretty much in the Black Zone, someone is always going to have a safety point within 3 to 4 screens, whether that's a hideout, a road, another zone, their friends. There's always something that can keep them safe, so you need to be able to kill people fairly quickly. Now, in order to do this effectively, every build is going to have 3 utility-based components. The first and most important thing that you're going to need is a purge for their boots of some sort. Without purging their boots, people are just going to get too far too fast and get to one of their many escapes too quickly. For this, most builds can use a Fiend Cowl, although some weapons like spears can use Cripple as well and use their helmet slot for something else. Second, your build is going to need mobility. Without mobility, people will just be able to space you and get away from you, as a lot of your targets are going to have high mobility themselves. Also, you really need mobility just to catch people in the first place. Really, a lot of mobility is going to come from your weapon, so make sure you choose a weapon that has at least some mobility on it. The last utility-based component of your build that you need is stealth. This one may seem a little bit weird, but the majority of your targets are Gatherers, and the majority of Gatherers in the Black Zone run Pest Lizards or some other super tanky mounts. If you don't have a way to catch Gatherers before they mount up, it's very unlikely you'll have a good time catching and killing Gatherers. For this, I've mainly used Assassin Jacket, as it's also good for escaping, but I'm sure there are some really interesting builds that could use Spectre Shoes or Invisibility Potions as well and be quite successful. The last thing that your build needs is just some way to kill people. Now for this, there's generally 2 routes you can go. One is more chase oriented and one is more burst oriented. So for the chase oriented, you just want some mobility, CC, essentially you just try to stick on people and constantly whittle them down until you finally kill them. For example, double-bladed stabs and sometimes one-handed spears work in this sort of way. The other way is to go high burst damage and just try to kill them very quickly after you catch them. These builds sacrifice some chase, and so if you don't one-shot them very quickly, they'll probably escape. However, they do have the benefit of being able to potentially kill things very close to safe spots like hideouts. An example of a more bursty type weapon would be Death Givers. So to make your final build, just keep these components in mind and think about things like how much spec you have in different items, especially your weapon. Generally you want to have as high IP as possible on your weapon. Here's an example build that I use in the one-handed spear. I find this to be really good because you have the cripple on the W, which can purge the boots, leaving your helmet to go something like Mage Cowl to give you extra damage to kill people. The other thing to think about with your build is your mount. If you're going a little bit lower tier, you can just go a normal horse as it has some carry weight attached to it, but if you're going higher tier like tier 8 equivalent or tier 9 equivalent, there are some really good other mounts like the Frost Ram and Terror Bird that can be really helpful in your solo ganking. The last thing to keep in mind with build is tier. People always ask me how much IP should I have or what tier gear should I be using for PvP, and while usually it doesn't matter for Black Zone solo PvP, it really does. You want to go as high tier as you're willing to lose. The higher IP you have, the greater chance you have of surviving, and especially on your weapon, the faster you kill people, meaning the more kills you'll get, as you really need to kill people as soon as you possibly can. My suggestion is that if you don't have at least 1100 IP on your weapon, you should spend some more time speccing up before you attempt this. Personally, I ran a tier 6 spear for a lot of the making of this video, which was 1200 IP, and I ended up upgrading later and regretting only going tier 6 because I did end up missing some big kills that I otherwise wouldn't have missed even if I went one tier higher. Okay, so the last general section that I wanted to go into detail is your general playstyle. So let's bring up the target list again really quickly, and remember that your main targets are gatherers and solo dungeoner. For solo dungeoners, you're going to have to catch them mounted in between their dungeons, and for gatherers, you're going to have to catch them dismounted while gathering because most of them run tanky mounts that are too inefficient to try to dismount yourself and then still chase them down afterwards. What this means is that you're going to have to run around dismounted. If you're on your mount, you pretty much have no chance of solo catching somebody who's mounted or catching a gatherer off guard when they're gathering. So my standard procedure is once I get into the zone, I look for areas that don't have safe spots 2 to 3 or 4 screens away from them. So for example, spots where there isn't any hideouts or roads or any zones people can zone out of. Once I'm in an area where I think if I can find someone I can kill them before they can get to a safe spot, I dismount and start walking along, usually going across ways that I think gatherers are going to be gathering, like the edge of the maps. From here on, it's pretty much the same as red zone ganking. You want to have your eyes at the edge of the screen in the direction that you're moving to give you the fastest possible reaction time, and then you have a different reaction based on if the person you see is mounted or dismounted. For a mounted player, you're going to want to go ahead and sprint at them as fast as possible and try to catch them, and as you're catching them, inspect them to see if you actually want to be dismounting and fighting that person. For example, if they look like a solo dungeoner, then you can go ahead and dismount them, but if they look like a ganker, usually you want to try to get out of there as soon as you possibly can. If they are dismounted, on the other hand, then you want to use your stealth as soon as you possibly can and get closer to them to see what they are, and if it's a gatherer or something else you want to kill, try to get close to them and then tag them up before they can mount. This is pretty much how I've got all of my big kills, was against gatherers and other people who are dismounted, sitting around on very expensive mounts like pest lizards. If you stealth at the edge of the screen, you have the advantage in terms of seeing them first, and so you can get the stealth off without them noticing you, and then it's just a simple dash or sprint or something to get on top of them and tag them before they can get that mount off, and then it's just you and them running, and you have the purge for their boots. Now, a lot of prideful gatherers watching this video say, oh, I would never get caught by that. Any good gatherer is going to see you before you stealth, but honestly, that's not my experience. I could go into a 10-minute long interlude about the psychology of perception and how you're favored in them not noticing you, but we don't have time for that here. 99% of the time, you'll get the stealth off before they notice you. Another thing that I like to do in order to even get to the zones in the first place is to take the roads of Avalon. As discussed, a lot of the zones you're going to be targeting are pretty deep in the Black Zone, and so it can take quite a long time to get there if you're going from a portal zone or even a rest town sometimes. So usually I just set out towards some random zone of interest and then check all the roads along the way. If they have roads that lead to zones that are 1 or 2 zones away from one of those high value zones, then I instead just switch up and go to that zone instead. Now, as I mentioned a little bit before, solo Black Zone ganking isn't the most safe activity, and so there's 2 things that I like to do in order to stay safe when I'm ganking. The first of these is when I get into my zone of interest, I try to take the road charges when I can, so that I have a potential escape in case some other group takes all of the charges. I have the free use for another 10 minutes. The second is that if you see a ganker that's from a gank group in one of the zones that you're in, I just leave immediately. Trying to gank other people while also dodging a gank group yourself is just way too difficult and way too dangerous, and so it's way better just to leave and find some other zone. Another thing that can be difficult about being deep in the black zone and ganking is securing your loot. Often I find myself going back quite often after I get a kill just to make sure I secure the loot, but another good option is using the Outlands chests that are scattered throughout the black zone and bringing it back later when you have an opportunity. Now, if one of your main focuses is making money from black zone ganking, what can be really helpful is bringing a couple swaps and some gathering gear along with you. If you're high tier gathering, I cannot tell you how many times I've passed like 500k to a mil worth of resources just sitting in some obscure corner of a tier 8 zone that's ready to be gathered. As I mentioned at the start, black zone ganking can sometimes be pretty slow, and so having sort of gathering tools along can be really helpful for just getting some extra money in and gathering in the slow periods. Having swaps like swaps to PVM sets is also really helpful. If you see like a crystal spider, for example, sometimes you can solo it before anyone else gets there, or even just a couple swaps for your ganking build to things that are better for fighting in case someone's, for example, doing a crystal spider and you want to fight them off it with a little bit better of a brawling gear. Now, the last thing about your playstyle that's really important is that a lot of the time in order to get kills, and especially to get good kills, is you sort of just have to shove a sock down your pants and go for it. There are so many situations where there are kills that you should have no chance of getting, where there are fights that you should have no chance of winning, that you essentially just want to take anyways. For example, there's going to be lots of times where you find someone like a gatherer or a solo dungeoneer very close to their hideout and deem that you don't really have room to kill them, or where you get a solo dungeoneer dismounted and then his friends show up and they should easily be able to beat you in a fight, but really in these situations, my best suggestion is to just go for it. Really, there are two things that really mess with your opponents that you have to remember when you're solo PvPing in the black zone. The first is something we briefly mentioned earlier, and that's no one solo ganks in the black zone anymore. Think about it, if you're in the black zone and you get dismounted by an enemy, do you assume they're alone, or do you assume that they have 20 people spread out inside of the zone as well? If you spend enough time in the black zone, you know that there's supposed to be 20 more people there, because that really is just the state of the black zone. A lot of the time, especially against things like solo dungeoners who are dismounting to try to scare you off and save their friend, it's really just a chicken fight. They don't really want to fight you, they're kind of scared, they think you have more people, so if you show confidence, they will just bail on their friend. The second thing that you have to remember is think about the first or second time you got ganked for a second. How calm were you? I know the first time that I got ganked, it definitely got my heart rate up a little bit. I was definitely panicking a little bit, and so you kind of have to assume that when you're ganking somebody else, they're not going to play perfectly. Remember, your targets are gatherers and solo dungeoners, two people who are not doing PvP activities and who oftentimes aren't very experienced at PvP. It's almost a guarantee that when you gank someone and get them dismounted that they're not going to play perfectly on their escape. They're going to be making some mistakes. There's so many times where someone could have just taken their hands off of their keyboard, walked to their hideout and pressed the entrance to get in and escaped from me, but completely panicked, accidentally got in combat and let me kill them for free. When people get ganked, a lot of times they panic, and when people are panicking, they make a lot of mistakes, making them very easy prey. Now, before this video ends, I just wanted to touch on one more thing that I mentioned in the beginning, which is how this black zone solo ganking is very difficult and requires a lot of game knowledge. I don't think I made this explicit enough in any other section, so I wanted to give a special section to it. When solo ganking for the first time in the black zone, you're probably going to die a lot. Being good at PvP helps, but honestly the most important thing is just knowledge of the black zone. You need to be able to inspect someone and pretty well instantly know whether that person is a danger to you or a target for you. Things like what gear they have, what zone they're in, what guild or alliance they're from are all really important factors that you have to take into account pretty much as soon as you inspect someone, because you really don't have a lot of time before you have to make your decision whether you run away or whether you dismount them and try to fight them. Really, the state of the black zone is ever changing, so I can't really give you some rule or some tips about certain guilds or alliances or zones because it will constantly change, but the more that you do this, the faster you'll learn what people to avoid and what people to target. The learning curve is definitely a little bit harsh. You will die a lot at the start, and if you don't treat it with a learning first attitude, you'll probably just get really frustrated and quit right away. So all this really is to say, the best advice I can give you throughout this video is to be patient and try to treat everything as a learning experience. There's something to learn from every encounter you have, and the faster that you learn those lessons, the faster you'll be on your way to dominating the Black Zone. Okay, that's all that I have for this video. I hope you find it helpful, and I would love to see some more solo gankers in the Black Zone.